Okay, so now it's recording. So I have prepared speech, but clearly this is a discussion, so feel free to jump in anytime you want. Bernard, I know you will have a lot to say. Sam, you'll have a lot to say as well. Yeah, so we're doing this because we're doing the Lenin reading group over the summer, Lenin in 1917. And the opening 2 weeks are going to be dealing with Lenin in 1905. Because his April thesis very directly refers to what happened in 1905, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, and how the old Bolsheviks were sort of using this in a conservative sense. We'll get to that, but when I saw that in the syllabus, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to do some kind of teach-in, because we sort of skip over 1905 in the syllabus. We get it through the mass strike, results and prospects, and the Spartacus League pamphlet, the Richard Seymour one, but we sort of get it indirectly. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get the history as it actually happens. So feel free to jump in at any time. Okay, so why do a teach-in on 1905 in the centennial of 1917? It appears that I am 12 years late. I thought it was necessary to do this because I found it impossible to talk about 1917 without reference to 1905. All of the conditions in 1917 found their genesis in 1905 and before. The mass strike, the Soviets, the growing inter-imperialist rivalries, the national liberation movements, the slogans, the secret agreement between the unions and the party in Germany, the clarity of the task, the knowledge that we were living in the era of revolution. In fact, in a note comparing 1895 to 1905 that Lenin wrote to himself on Bloody Sunday, so January 9th, or the 22nd, depending on the old or new style, he writes, "Scope in 1895, only circles then. Propaganda very heavy and academic. Today, revolutionary epoch." In fact, reflecting 20 years later on this, Leon Trotsky would say that 1905 was the first genuine revolution in Russia. So he's saying, yes, we've had mutinies before, we've had the Decemberist revolt, we've had lots of peasant uprisings before, we've had terrorist acts, but this is the first revolution in the modern sense, masses of people rising up. I'm not trying to claim I am an expert on 1905, but I rather want to flag how obscure the relationship has become, which says something about historical experience and how it used to be accumulated. There's a famous line that the Bolsheviks used to say even before October 1917, that 1905 was the dress rehearsal. This is a phrase liable to abuse. A rehearsal is a trial performance for a latter performance. One remembers the cues, there's rote memorization, etc. They try to perfect the act in order to prevent any contingency. But history is not a laboratory, where if you just do something wrong, you just correct for the problem in the future. Insurrection is an art, Marx used to say, and this was one of Lenin's favorite lines. It is not something that has a formula, but rather, just like how we understand art, is a judgment of the speculative type, of how do the present forms point beyond themselves. In this sense, 1905 was a rehearsal like how a child learns how to walk, hopefully to one day run. They learn how to use their limbs, they learn how different environments respond to their actions. The proletariat in Russia in 1905 learned how to treat the class as an object and a subject. Lenin used to say that strikes were a school of war, but not the war itself. What happened in 1905 was finally practiced at war. No one, anarchists, socialists, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, even liberals, denied this. All of these groups wanted freedom, freedom for society and freedom for individuals. They all saw themselves as revolutionaries. Where they differed was on what they considered the depth of the task and the possibilities that were being engendered by the revolution. So I'm going to start off with just some timeline. Where to start? Let's start at the RSDLP, it's the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, at the Second Congress, which we were just talking about before Sam and Sid came in 1903. This is necessary because the justification for the Bolshevik-Menshevik split is still being pursued in the 1905 revolution, right? Lenin literally kind of looks crazy at this time. We all know the story. Lenin wrote what is to be done before the Congress to expound the view of the Iskris, that's the spark, which included Lenin, Plekhanov, Martov, Zasulich, and Lenin tried to get Trotsky on the Iskra board, but it was denied by Plekhanov. They were supposed to win hegemony within the Social Democratic Party, but when the discussion moved to rules for membership, which, to sort of summarize, was should a dues-paying party member be required to participate in and be responsible to an organization, whereas Martov's line was simply, if you gave money, you could be part of the party without belonging to any organization. Once that happens, we have a split in the Russian Social Democratic Party that gives us the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. At the time, the split seemed excessive to some, especially those in West Europe. Kautsky, in a letter, and I think it's to Babel, I don't really remember, it might be Axelrod actually, said he couldn't tell the difference between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And this is like everybody at the time. Trotsky was at the time part of the Mensheviks. Luxemburg and Trotsky both wrote polemics against Lenin in 1904. Trotsky wrote Our Political Tasks, and Luxemburg wrote the Organizational Questions. On the basis that Lenin was setting up the party to be captured by a petty bourgeois demagogue in the coming Bourgeois Revolution, or even worse, this was Trotsky's phrase, it was substitutionism, that the party was going to substitute for the masses. And of course, this would be used against Trotsky later once Stalinism happened. In the intervening period between then and the 1905 revolution, Plekhanov had changed his support from the Bolsheviks to the Mensheviks. And the Mensheviks started self-critiquing their support for what is to be done, even though they had all supported it when it was originally written. And we get what was called the new Iskra, because Lenin leaves Iskra and the membership, or the editorial board changes. Therefore, going into 1905, Lenin really felt at odds with most of the Russian Social Democrats, justifying the split mainly on intuition, and actually really blaming Martov, who, when we watch Fall of Eagles, he literally stands up and says, I will not be on a board with that person, and then walks out with Zasulich. So Lenin would say, it's really you who's causing the split. But by the end of 1905, all three of these radicals of the Second International would find themselves on the same side, and even Kautsky for some time. So Kautsky's defending the Bolsheviks in 1906, 1907. 1904 was a year of growing unrest as well, as growing political prospects for all tendencies, liberalism and socialism, in the democratic movement. The Russo-Japanese War ended in a sordid defeat for the Russians, and the effect was extremely demoralizing for the entire population, especially the sailors, who would end up being very active in mutinies in 1905, Battleship Potemkin, as well as the Svetspol Rising. A statement leaked around this time admitted that the government was willing to continue sacrificing lives so as not to lose to Imperial Japan, which angered a lot of the liberals, who began demanding the end of the war. 100 years later, reflecting on 1905, during the anti-war movement of the mid-2000s, Peter Glatter of the ISO would refer to this as the first Stop the War movement. So this is how 1905 has looked at different times in the last century, or now century and a dozen. Around this time, there was growing political use of the Zemstevos, or it was the municipal bodies by the liberals. There were these banquets where the liberals would campaign for representative institutions, and they would bring workers up and interview them, and then kind of throw the workers away, because the workers would start demanding 8-hour days, and they'd be like, no, get off the stage, right? And so there was literally a liberal spring in the final months of 1904. Eventually, what was called the Radical Sons, it was the students of these liberals, began joining the movement. They made it more militant, and this brought its socialist ideas. This led to several demonstrations in November and December, but the sons didn't get any support from the fathers, let alone the workers, so they were just all arrested. Nevertheless, this would have an effect on the Mensheviks, specifically Martov, who thought they had discovered a third element, which he called the democratic intelligentsia. So rather than just the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, he thought there was this third group that could play for them. Around this time, the government also had what was called Zubetov unions, and of course they had been set up much before this, but they became sort of radical at this time, which were the police-run unions. The government put them up in order to get workers to focus on economic issues and not political issues, so they could easily appropriate socialist ideas, economist ideas. So they would say, you should work on bettering your position, on building workers' power, right? So this is something the Tsarist government could support. At the end of December 1904, the Putilov factory in Petersburg went on strike, and in response, 11 workers' sections went on strike as well. What became clear was the limit of these strikes. The workers realized that they would have to win political powers in order to broaden the terrain of their struggle. They turned to an influential Russian Orthodox priest, who was a political agent at this time, Father George Gapon. And they gave him a petition which included not only standard liberal rights, but also the demand for the 8-hour day, and labor legislation like protection for the job and union organizing. It is important to point out the relationship between the political and economic, and Rosa Luxemburg speaks about this in Mass Strike, Lenin and What Is to Be Done. The economic limits of the police unions were set by the political considerations. And eventually, the idea was that the winning of a democratic republic would enact back upon the economic struggle. That would be the terrain for socialism. And so we get Bloody Sunday, January 9th, 1905. Infamously, Peter Struve, who was a legal Marxist turned liberal by the end of 1905, said there is no revolutionary people in Russia yet, about 2 days before Bloody Sunday. This was wrong already when it was written, and not merely 2 days later. George Gapon led a march to the Winter Palace with a petition. In a way, perhaps even to Gapon and himself, this evoked the images of an ancient peasant tradition of going to ask the little father, the Tsar, to ask for security and protection, right? It's like these peasants asking the kings in the medieval ages. But there was a difference. Social democracy had radicalized the workers. They pushed Father Gapon to play a role that he himself would eventually try to throw off. Despite the warnings of some intelligentsia of expected ambush, the workers marched on the Winter Palace and were met with a volley of bullets. Father Gapon pretended to be dead, sort of lying in the snow, and then ran off with his supporters. And so the image of the benevolent Tsar was destroyed. Soon after, a little bit, there was the Shidlovsky Commission, he was just a senator, and they were going to set up sort of workers' delegates and some kind of delegation system. It was a two-tiered system to kind of send representatives to talk to the Tsar. And this was met with the liberals, and the Mensheviks were really happy for this. They thought it was a good concession, but this just fell through because it was never popular. So that's kind of the setup of 1905 right there. And so I'll eventually talk about October, November, December, but I wanted to say what comes up in the middle, which is when all of the Marxists get involved in this. So this section is called the Bourgeois Revolution. Georgy Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism, had said in 1883 that the next Russian Revolution would be a bourgeois revolution. Before they could have socialism, the country would have to go through this stage, and from that they would develop capitalism. This stage was something that one could not leap over. Due to this, it meant that the bourgeoisie were going to take leadership in the next revolution. It followed from this that the role of the proletariat was not to scare the bourgeoisie away, but instead to display tact, as he put it. There's a theory that can be garnered from Marx to justify this. So Marx has this line in The Class Struggles in France where he says that England is the demiurge of bourgeois society, and so that all the backward countries on the continent at the time, like France and Germany, would follow England. And so we can see how he's saying, look, Russia's even more backward, so they'll follow those countries. Furthermore, the experience of 1848 showed that indeed the bourgeoisie was frightened when the workers demanded their bourgeois rights. The Mensheviks were a little bit farther than this. In fact, they saw themselves as being actually more orthodox Marxists than the Bolsheviks at this time. They were hesitant to participate in any provisional revolutionary government in the same way that Plekhanov was, because they thought if they got in, they would be unable to deliver socialism and they would delegitimize the brand, if you may, actually, for all the workers. And it would happen again like what happened in 1848. We have Louis Blanc. He tries to get the national workshops at socialism, but he can't. They haven't smashed up the state. And so the idea is don't participate in a bourgeois provisional revolutionary government. And also they had this idea that why would we use the peasants? They've always been reactionary. And in fact, they were part of the counter-revolution in 1848. And even in the original French Revolution, it's the Vendée area of France. They have good history of being reactionary. Thus, the Mensheviks wanted to be a party of extreme opposition. They didn't think now was the time for power, so they weren't against it altogether. They just thought it was not ripe. Furthermore, they wanted to take up a socialist organization. So they had a demand for revolutionary communes, and they established this in their April-May Congress in Geneva. In fact, perhaps before Lenin and Trotsky, they recognized the Soviets as being the forms of revolutionary workers' organization. But this would change by the end of the revolution because they would start to have a different view of the Soviets with respect to the bourgeois state. And this is really where the differences started to come through. This is interesting because it's precisely here that we can see a variegated response. Lenin condemned the Mensheviks for confusing the democratic with the socialist revolution. I know I just misspoke and said Bolsheviks, and actually a lot of the old Bolsheviks were taking this exact position until Lenin eventually arrived in 1905. The Mensheviks responded by accusing Lenin of elitism, of being a Blanquist. He was so obsessed with taking power that he was forgetting the daily work of organizing the proletariat and just focusing on taking power. They criticized what they saw as an authoritarian party. So Israel Geltzer, who is the biographer of Martov, sums up his view very succinctly. Martov's tactical thinking was appropriate to a party which wanted to foment revolution but to abstain from taking power. So he wanted to just kind of agitate all the time. While Lenin might seem right-wing because individuals like Plekhanov, who had swung even more rightward, were saying we needed a bourgeois revolution, it in fact said something about politics going back to the genesis of Marxism. The Spring of Nations in 1848 was a farce for Marx of the French Revolution, the tragedy. The Republicans, the liberals, as he says, literally went extinct. So the bourgeoisie is actually dead for Marx after 1848. That's very key. The class struggle, we must remember, is sub-bourgeois, right? So like to speak of classes really in the French Revolution would have been seen to be separating up the democratic revolution. But that happens as a function of history, and this is what we get in 1848. So this is why class struggle is sub-bourgeois in a certain way. So Axelrod and Plekhanov's view that the workers not scare off the bourgeoisie is a demand for the class struggle to cease. For Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky following Marx, the class struggle wasn't something demanded, it wasn't say go and have a class struggle, but something that existed, and it was going to be resolved one way or another, socialism or barbarism. Trotsky's view was actually the closest to Lenin here, and in fact was a view shared by a German named Parvis. So this is the so-called permanent revolution. And eventually after the revolution, Parvis would become totally skeptical of revolution and swing totally rightward and supported Germany in World War I and supported Ebert putting down Luxembourg, etc. So for this brief time, he had like some genius and then kind of flew away into who knows what. Trotsky would later say that in fact Lenin did agree with him and admitted it at the Fourth Reunification Congress the following year. So, thus, if there was disagreement, it would be around the slogan, permanent revolution, or the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and proletariat. The real difference just seemed to be that Trotsky had followed the conclusion. So, in other words, he did agree, yes, it will be the peasants and proletariat that take power, but his point is, what is going to happen once that government, that provisional government, happens? It's that the proletariat, in order to consolidate power, is going to have to take the leadership right there. And that this would eventually, and this is Trotsky following Kautsky as well, this would cause a revolution, or it would necessitate a revolution in Western Europe, right? So the famous line of Russia being the weakest link in imperialism, not being a backward country as in, like, I don't know, very backward, but being sort of the most backward of the industrialized countries. Because as we know, in fact, Russia was using the latest technology in machinery at the time, and it was having imported all of the finest machinery and capital.
But it was the weakest bourgeois.
But it was the weakest, exactly. And that's usually, because sometimes people turn that into like, oh, so you just find like the most oppressed country in the world or something like that. And that's why we, the abuse of that is why we can get all this sort of third worldism in the 20th century, where it's like just peripheral countries that, yeah, you can get like a coup or something, but it doesn't necessitate revolution in, say, the US. Whereas the point, and this is really Kautsky's insight, is no, a revolution in Russia will necessitate a revolution in the West because of how it's linked up. And of course, once the proletariat starts growing in Russia at this time, Germany and England start sending in money and start training the counter-revolutionary forces. In fact, they were already meddling in the Russia-Japanese War, so Britain and France were backing Japan, and Germany was egging on Russia. So they already were like playing around in the area as a function of their capital interests. Okay. And then I wanted to say, on to the anarchists as well, because I don't want to leave them out. In fact, the anarchists have come to see 1905 in Russia as a refutation of Marxism, in fact. They claim that prior to 1905, the mass strike was dismissed by Marxists, usually referring to Engels as an article, The Bakuninists at Work, his polemic against the anarchist strike in Spain, which he wrote right after the collapse of the First International against Bakunin, to be like, okay, let's see what Bakunin's followers do. They go and get everybody killed. There's some truth to this. The anarchists had been isolated or thrown out of the Second International by 1905, yet all of a sudden they were getting a hearing on the mass strike in 1905. So Vorwärts in Germany was like publishing anarchists out of nowhere, even though they were thrown out of the congresses, a few decades prior. In the works on Russia after 1917, the anarchists have even come to subordinate 1917 to 1905. That is because 1905 is seen as more spontaneous. The Soviets are spontaneous, the mass strike is spontaneous, it's not called by a party, etc. And of course, the old Noam Chomsky line that it's later hijacked by the Bolsheviks, right? So we had these spontaneous forms, and then these intellectuals come in and hijack them. The anarchists then see the Marxists as contradicting themselves in 1905, that they only come over to the mass strike because it's popular, and thus they find Luxemburg's pamphlet to actually be disingenuous and dishonest. An attempt of the Marxists to cover Engels' previous condemnation of the work of the Bakuninists through dialectical rococo, right? Like, oh, it's a new form and content, and I'm going to give an explanation for why we support it all of a sudden. So, of course, this means we have to bring up Rosa Luxemburg. She only got into Russia in December of 1905 under the name of Anna Machka. Her reflection on the revolution had an affinity with Lenin and Trotsky, but for different reasons. While the Russian Marxists were concerned with how the revolutionary provisional government would act, Luxemburg was interested in showing how the German workers should take responsibility for the Russian Revolution. Indeed, it was the labor struggles and union gains in Germany that caused German capital to invest in Russia, to maintain the union wages, right? Imperialism. And by the way, it was these two bohemian intellectuals from Germany whose ideas had inspired a certain revolutionary fervor in the East. Luxemburg tasked herself with trying to break through the inertia of her party by using the product of their history, the 1905 revolution, to reanimate the SPD. The revisionist dispute had just formally ended in the SPD, although we know it actually resolved for the revisionists against the orthodoxy. And the conservative trade unions leaned on Marxist dismissals of the mass strike to prevent the influence of the Russian revolutionaries. So already by January 1905, there were strikes in Germany that the trade unions were actually trying to put down. So there was like a miners' strike, and they were like, no, this is a bunch of anarchists, right? That's not us, we're not a backwards country, we're an industrialized country. But if the mass strike was the form of the bourgeois revolution in Russia, then it was the task of the proletariat returning from 1848. We might even say that the Marxists had to change in order to stay true to Marx. What Marx had articulated in 1848 was not a closed form or a system, but rather a fallout, a failure, a disintegration of society, an impasse that required political leadership. Almost everybody, the revisionists, the Mensheviks, the anarchists, the liberals, except for the radicals of the Second International, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, treated Marx's experience of 1848 as something which had a definite period. They said that was 1848. This is now. Okay? And so, the Benjamin reading that we just did last week, they would sort of look through history in the same way that a historian rummages for examples, right? They would say, oh, those were the conditions in 1848, and these are our conditions now, and so it has nothing to do with it. It's just changed conditions. Whereas they realized that under those changed conditions, actually it was the same old problem, right? So there's like two sides to the dialectic. There's the static and the dynamic side. And it's not simply changed conditions that get rid of old problems, right? It's rather the old in distress that's continuing to emerge. The bourgeois revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries had the form of general strikes, of agrarian revolutions, of workers' government. But that doesn't make it a mere window dressing. A change in form means a change in the content as well, and indeed much had happened since 1848. The form expressed how the bourgeois revolution had been taken up by the proletariat and shirked by the bourgeoisie. The economic strike and the agrarian revolution were the French, American, English revolutions in the 20th century. This is a change to preserve the task of the bourgeois revolution, and the point of preserving the task is so that society can truly be changed. In other words, like the reason the workers had to do a mass strike or an economic strike or mass political strike is because that's how they could get a hold of the government. So it comes up through the Zubitovs, through the police unions as well, and that's where they're getting the limits of the economics. So they're like, in order to be political, it's going to take the form of something economic, but really it's politically directed. And we got a little bit of this in the Rosa Luxemburg pamphlet when she mentions textile workers going on strike, and they know they're going to lose wages. They know actually economically it's going to be worse for them afterwards. And yet they do it anyways for the political solidarity. Not even solidarity, for the political attack, right? They're the worker bees. They're going to sting in order to, and they might have to sacrifice themselves, but they'll sting for the revolution. And then finally, the liberals, because we have to talk about them as well. They treat 1905 as a distorted expression of the bourgeois revolution. And indeed, there's a truth to that. So Count Witte, who was the Minister of the Interior for the most militant part of the revolution, and the liberals considered that was their man on the inside, and he was not liked by the Tsar at all. He wasn't liked by any of the ministers and any of the police force. He considered all the socialists and revolutionaries to be a, quote, disturbed balance between the ideological aspirations of Russia's thinking public and the outward forms of life. This was a minister of the Russian government who was sympathetic to the revolution. And the non-government liberals were in fact supportive and called themselves revolutionaries all the way up until the end of 1905, where they then felt the revolution was infringed upon by plebeian Jacobinism. It would actually echo latter liberal views of 1917, that Marxism was a theory of backward countries and really was just a form of anarchism. So in 1917, the Bolsheviks were called Bakuninists, not just by Kautsky, but also just by liberals in the West as well. And of course, who I'm referencing as well is Woodrow Wilson, who sort of was like, oh, Marxism is some kind of radical, like, feudal expression. It's a radical theory in a feudal country that's backwards, and this is why we're getting a distorted expression. So putting an end to Marxism to him was also putting an end to feudalism, not just the Tsar as well. Okay, so the next part on the Soviets. The Soviets were recognized as revolutionary by all, Marxists, socialists, anarchists, and liberals. When exactly the Soviets emerged is still a controversy today. The standard story is that they emerged out of the strike committees and the mass strikes later in October of 1905. That's kind of the standard story. That is, once entire cities were shut down, complete disorganization of the existing government was created, and the Soviets emerged out of the strike committees. Some have credited the Mensheviks with being the first party to make the demand for revolutionary communes and workers' self-organization, and thus to be the ideological parents. And so when Odessa happened, so the Odessa uprising happened, Martov was like, yes, that's what we want. Those are workers taking over the city and having revolutionary communes. And so this is before even Lenin is saying that much about the Soviets. He's still kind of, what are these forms exactly? Volin, who was an anarchist who later participated in the 1917 revolution, says that he was part of the genesis of the Soviet before Bloody Sunday, even. He says he was approached by workers, and they were like, we want you to be our leader, and he was like, no, I'm an anarchist, we have no leaders. And so this is the kind of myth that he makes for himself. It might have been true that that was the genesis of the Soviets. In fact, the Bolsheviks were somewhat hostile before Lenin arrived in Russia to the Soviets because they saw them as competing with the Party for Working Class Support. The benefit of the Soviet was also its drawback. It allowed anybody to join and participate in the democratic structure. As a result, it had an expansive mass base. But this meant it also took the full character of mass society, for all of its contradictions under capitalism. Democracy had become contradictory in capital, and this was best reflected in the vacillations and inconsistency of the petty bourgeoisie. That is, they are a democracy, they are an expression of democracy, and the reason they go back and forth is because they are contradictory in their demands. And by the way, this is why Marx's address to the Communist League was very popular amongst the Mensheviks at this time, because they considered themselves following Marx on this, that they were pushing democracy, and this is why they were the extreme opposition. In this sense, the Soviets would come to be the phenomenal expression of the masses, with the party being the expression of the class. The non-identity between the masses and the class was important to uphold. To just have it be the self-organization of the workers, or just the party and forget about that, or even to have the Soviet be the revolutionary form itself, was to collapse the masses and the class. So in fact, their sort of difference is what's important right there. And that's actually how the class could exercise leadership, to be like, this is where the mass expression is, and this is our relationship to it. And by the way, when they had the Soviet had to defend itself against the Tsar's prosecutors, there was a rule in the Soviets at the time that they wouldn't have party members be on the delegation. And so they used this as like an advantage to say, no, we didn't call the insurrection, it was spontaneously decided. But of course, they were the ones that were agitating for it, but they could say they had no responsibility for it. So they kind of used a little dialectical rococo to get out of that one. And Rosa Luxemburg says the same thing in her defense. She goes, no, the mass strike, we can't call it. It's called by the masses, right? But of course, she wants it. Anyways, just some dates. In June, Battleship Potemkin. I don't want to talk about that. There's a good movie. July, there's the uprising in Svetspol. This is the sailors and the soldiers. It's a more concerted uprising, and they actually have the ships signaling, and they have like red ships and etc. It's put down by soldiers, so they sort of divide the military, where the sailors tended to be more proletarian, especially the engineers. That was their background. Whereas the peasantry were conscripts. So this is how they were getting, they kind of divided the democratic forces. So what was learned there was, no, we actually have to win the soldiers over. In August, we get the Bulyagin, I don't know if I pronounced that right, Bulgin Duma, whatever, who knows. This Duma is boycotted by the Bolsheviks and Trotsky, but the Mensheviks support it and actually are ferociously against people who are boycotting it because they're like, you're leading the masses into the Black Hundreds, like this is time to agitate and to learn political experience. Lenin and Trotsky's view is that this is kind of the bait that's being thrown out by the Tsar to try to capture the revolution right there. And of course, this is their running argument the entire time, is that if you want an assembly, we're going to have the proletariat take power. Because whatever is sort of dangled right there is, it's not going to be real. It's not going to be consistent. And of course, this, I don't know how you can prove things, but to them, this is what comes true when we get the reactionary Duma, the Stolpen Duma later in 1907, is, see, we told you liberals that unless we took power, you're not going to get this constituency and assembly. In October, this is where like the famous strikes start to happen that lead to the Constitution, or the Constitutional Manifesto. At this time, the liberals and capitalists are supporting the mass strike. They just deduct the wages, but they're down with it. Like, yeah, we support the mass strike. So it's not like strikes are somehow anti, the capitalists all of a sudden. And it actually goes to the political character, which is that they understood it as this is the Bourgeois Revolution, and it's working for us. It starts, the bakers on the 10th start the strike, and then the typesetters follow. There's strikes in Petersburg and Moscow. They shut down the trains. On October 17th, they get the manifesto. This is where you'll see this name come up in the future, the Octoberists. So they form out of this constitutional manifesto that is going to promise legal rights as well as just general bourgeois rights like selfhood, etc. And the Octoberists are sort of the liberals and landowners. It's kind of the upper bourgeoisie. And they later make a kind of coalition with the lower bourgeoisie of the cadets. So these names, just putting them out, will come up with them over the summer. The workers don't trust this, and they try to go further. And what the communists do is they try to say, well, look, we're promised this manifesto, and yet Trepov and Durnovov, who are the police chiefs, are just running through Petersburg and Moscow just shooting people. So how can we be having this constitutional illusion when on this hand they actually attack people for exercising their rights? So this is what they're pushing on, and this is how they get the masses to not accept the Constitutional Manifesto. There we go. Also around this time, the Soviet starts representing itself as the executive, and it's saying, look, you can disobey Tsarist laws if you want, but you have to obey our laws. So you have to obey our censorship, you have to obey our forms of the strike, etc., or our legal upholding of property. And so they're actually making a bid for sovereignty. And it actually goes into an interesting question, which is that the Soviet literally causes disorganization for the state. It looks like anarchy, and this is like a standard liberal framework, which is, okay, if you have two executives, who's putting the power in, or who's implementing the laws, who's upholding the laws? But from the Soviet standpoint, it's like, okay, this could be the state of tomorrow, right? This could be the smashing up of the state. And so it's important how it can be understood from two different directions, where the Soviet sees itself as exercising the right of labor, but the government's like, this is straight up anarchism. And that both can actually be correct, because from the government's perspective, it is anarchy on a standard liberal understanding. Then in November, the strike in November takes on a more focused and proletarian character. There's a growing financial crisis, and the Tsarist state has to start relying on loans from the French bourse. The capitalists begin who were involved in the Russian Revolution start locking out the factories, so the workers can't go to work when they want. So that's their response to mass strikes. And this begins to raise the question of insurrection. For the workers to survive, they need to expropriate the factory, but the property rights of the owner are upheld by the state. Hence, you need a workers' state. And so it's raising the question of who is actually upholding the law. Furthermore, an insurrection in Kronstadt leads to the capture of many soldiers, and they also announce martial law in Poland. And so all of these things together are leading to workers striking in demand of amnesty for the political prisoners and to remove martial law from Poland. The capitalists meet around this time, and they're starting to get a little bit worried because they know they can't rely on the constitution being put in place by the Tsar, but they also know that they can't have these revolutionaries in the street as well. And this, of course, is what Lenin in June and July was so-called predicting, which is that the bourgeoisie are going to become inconsistent in practice, and that all of these hopes that the Mensheviks have had on them are actually criminal to the revolution. And it's not because the bourgeoisie are evil people, it's just from their perspective, trying to uphold their interests, they literally become inconsistent. That's why they become opportunistic. One of the demands at the time, and this is sort of important, was the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day has no direct relevance for a lot of the peasant masses because they are self-employed and they are farmers or whatever. But there's a campaign to get the masses over for the 8-hour day. And so it's sort of considered a victory at this time that the proletariat can get the democratic masses to see their interests in their own interests, in their proletarian interests. Even if they have no direct economic interest, they see it as their political interest. And so that's what it means, leadership right there. This is why the proletarian class could lead, is because people who actually might not be wage laborers can find their interests in the proletariat. That's what makes it possible, right? And so, whenever there's all these talks later in the 60s about who are the new vanguards or anything, it all became a discussion about who's the most oppressed group, and that must be the new vanguard. And they skipped the whole question of political leadership, which is what it always was. And so this is sort of the example here, I guess I would say, right? Which is that, yes, they could win them over to supporting this, even if it didn't directly benefit them. And December begins the insurrection. So Trotsky at this time is the head of the Petersburg Soviet. He sort of famously says when the Soviet is surrounded, he yells down to the delegates, "Don't fire." If anybody fires, it's an agent provocateur, so they don't want to fight the police. That's fine. But instead what they do is they take their guns and they smash them so they don't go into the hands of the police, their weapons. So at this point, the necessity of insurrection becomes clear for the masses in practice, but it is too late. The Social Democrats and Social Revolutionaries enter into literally a guerrilla war in Moscow. They literally send around sharpshooters and druzinki, which are small little soldier bands. I don't know if I pronounced it right. But literally, it's the total count is 800 people versus an entire military. And so they just kind of drive them insane in Moscow for a while. At this time, Milyukov, who was the head figure of the cadets, or the head intellectual and political figure, this is where the term Trotskyism comes from, actually, for the first time. So he says, the problem that's happening right now are all these revolutionary illusions of Trotskyism. And it's here where Trotsky claims that this term was originated, and so when Stalin uses it later in the debates of the 20s, he says, "Oh, you're repeating Milyukov from 1905. And so it's kind of this moment of him repeating a cadet.
What does he mean by Trotskyism in this moment?
Because Trotsky's a head figure in the Soviet. And so the liberal understanding is, look, we got this constitution, and you guys are sort of pushing for these radical aims. And not only are they radical, maybe they don't agree with them, maybe they do, maybe they are fine with an 8-hour day. They see it as fomenting sort of reactionary responses from the upper bourgeoisie and also from just reactionary forces like the Black Hundreds. So the government starts organizing bands. They literally, just get sort of the lumpen proletariat to go around and shoot people, but they also start doing patriotic demonstrations where they get pogromists and Black Hundreds, and just reactionary peasants, and they have police agents. And so what Milyukov is blaming Trotsky is for creating that. He says, like, all the agitation for the insurrection that's happening right now, you're the one that's causing this revolution to go south. Yeah. This Martov also has a similar view at this time where he says, well, I hope this doesn't end in a Jacobin dictatorship, which is his sort of understanding that the French Revolution was good until the Jacobins got in power, and then it went south, right? They're kind of putting too much fire on, and this is fomenting right-wing reaction, etc. So it's adventurism, right? Yeah. Does that answer? Okay. Yes, but this sentiment was common outside of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. So Plekhanov famously said around this time, they, the mutineers, or not mutineers, the insurrectionaries, should not have taken up arms. And after the 1905 revolution, Lenin republishes all of Marx's letters to Dr. Kugelman about the Paris Commune to be like, you, the father of Marxism. Like, Marx said, yeah, the Paris Commune, you shouldn't take up arms because you're going to be killed by by the German military and by the French military. But once they did, Marx was like, okay, I'm going all in then, and we're going to try to learn something from this. And in fact, this is Trotsky and Lenin and Luxemburg's view at this time as well.
But is there a way that they're repeating that same mistake of the Paris Commune by taking up arms? Or what's different in character?
Well, it goes to this question of, is the Soviet a repeat of the Paris Commune? And it is and it isn't, right? Because the Soviets are different. The Paris Commune comes out of a condition of, like, literally France gets defeated, and they have to arm the workers to defend Paris, and the workers just go, we're just going to take over all the factories. Whereas the Soviets came out of the strike committees. But Lenin would later say, look, this is a state of the Paris Commune type. And what he means by that is they don't have police in Petersburg or in Moscow. It's being run by the Soviet. So in other words, the workers are the police. Right? There's not a special body of armed men. In terms of if it's repeating, it's one of these questions of it does, but they would say they would treat it as if it went farther, because you don't just have one commune, you actually have lots of communes that are trying to bring the actual question of insurrection to the international scale, right? But this goes back to Marxism, which is, why does it appear like it's a theory when really Marx articulated something at a time? It's because we still live with that problem that's being repeated, like hell. Right? Repetition is hell. That's also done, you mean? Right? Where the women putting water in the vases with the holes.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Sisyphus.
Or Sisyphus. Until we can push it over. This brings up an interesting question, actually. I was going to talk about this. Should they have taken up arms? Was Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, and really the latter who was actually active in the Soviet, were they delusional for supporting the Moscow insurrection? The liberals in Plekhanov and tacitly Martov, although really he was just ambivalent, seem to say that this was a mistake on the part of the proletariat, and not merely because it ended in military defeat. Rather, the liberals would say, and Plekhanov would give it a Marxist coloring to it, that they were frightening away the bourgeoisie before they had even had a bourgeois revolution. France at least had a French Revolution, and so from there, he could give an explanation. Yes, they could actually strive for a dictatorship of the proletariat, but we don't even have that yet. And, I think I missed something. But from the perspective of Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky, no, this was like a necessary lesson that the workers had to go through. Okay. And of course, they might have seemed crazy up until then, but in 1917 it seems like that actually was a lesson worth winning. Okay. Right? I mean, it's hard to, it's one of these things in terms of victory and defeat, where it's always kind of like, well, what is what? Is it a victory or is it a defeat? Because for Plekhanov and the cadets, it's like, no, that's just a straight up defeat. You just get people murdered in the street.
What really differentiates learning in this fashion from what we talked about the other day, this Baconian, Francis Bacon sense of science?
Well, it was what I tried to take up at the beginning, which is it's not like we're just doing experiments in history, right? We're not in a vacuum. Right? So when you do an experiment in a lab, it's in a vacuum, and you're literally very specifically trying to recreate the same conditions. If you don't, it's like fraudulent science, right? You'll be ripped apart in a journal. Instead, what happens in history, it's sort of the repetition of moments, which really means tasks in different forms and different conditions. So in 1905, yeah, it is, not only is it a repetition of the Paris Commune, which is a repetition of 1848, but it's under a changed condition. It has social democracy. It has Marxists. Yes?
You know, there was another commune that people don't talk about a lot, and that's the St. Louis commune.
Yes.
So what were the forums that took place? I know the workers joined the national strike, but it was the German Marxists that crossed the river and went to the meeting and took control of it that led to them taking control of, 18 days, I think? They controlled.
Oh, in the St. Louis commune.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of course a lot of Red 48ers were in the U.S. and it was Marx's publisher. What's his name? I can't believe I'm blanking on this right now. Of the 18th Brumaire.
Yeah.
Joseph Weiland. Yes, who he writes the famous letter to that Marx says, I have only one contribution in history. So he was actually like the head of that commune. That's a good example because I actually don't have much to say about this. The only thing I have of Engels mentioning that in a letter saying, oh, don't you know they took power in St. Louis? But the question really is, did they get at the same task? And they might have. Like, yeah, they probably did take the police out and everything like that. It's not something I know that much about.
I don't know a lot about it. I know a lot of capitalists fled the city.
Yeah.
A lot of them locked themselves in their houses.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the workers took over the post office and food production and everything else
Yes.
until federal troops came in.
Oh, yeah, no, it lasted a little bit, much less than the Paris Commune, which I guess
18
was...
days.
Yeah, so Paris Commune was a month or a few months, right?
Yeah. For 71 days.
The thing with Marx as well is that even though he talks about the Paris Commune in 1848 Paris, that doesn't mean that's like, it's just that that's a classic example. It's an archetypical example. So sometimes when people think about Bonapartism, for example, they think it's something that only happened in France at the time. Whereas really Marx's point is, no, this is the general condition of capital, of politics and capital. So in other words, it actually did happen in England, but it just doesn't happen in insurrections and street fights. In Germany in 1848, it's literally the bourgeoisie just don't arm the workers. They just like don't give them guns.
So it's really just that these moments are an expression that's an acute example of these contributions?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So they're the best lessons we might be able to have.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's also one of these things that
This kind of goes a bit with
Yeah.
like what, I don't know, one of the, I think it was the aphorisms. No, it wasn't aphorisms. It might have been the week before the Horkheimer. No, it was the Horkheimer where he's talking.
The Authoritarian State
The
by Max
Authoritarian
Horkheimer.
State, he mentions briefly like every moment's a revolutionary moment.
Yeah.
But it seems like he's also saying like what matters is how people grasp it.
Exactly.
And act on it. Okay.
Like we can say 1848 moments are returning all the time, but just there's nothing there to make it appear. So this was also with Benjamin when he says, like when history is a product, we literally produce it. And so when Lenin and Luxemburg and Trotsky say it's the return of 1848, like they can see it very clearly and they're making it apparent to masses of people. It's very difficult to say that now. Like 1848, I feel like I'm reading a fictional novel at times,
Yeah.
right? It's like here's a story from an alternate universe. I don't, like right now we're definitely living through a change, right? Trump and Bernie Sanders definitely were expressions of a change that needed to happen in 2008 that didn't happen at the time, right? Obama was able to kick it down, even though Obama actually was changing plenty of things. The whole point of TPP was to sort of change relations against China anyways.
But I think the class struggle led to the Occupy movement that made a major change in people's consciousness on class and set the stage for Bernie Sanders.
Oh, I definitely think Occupy had a relationship to Bernie Sanders, which is why I wasn't surprised when I heard Bernie Sanders, but it was different when I would encounter 18 and 19-year-olds here who thought it was something totally different. But then again, that goes to the question of history right there, of the historical part. In terms of Occupy, I think that was a last attempt to push Obama before the 2012 election. Right, but Occupy, is that Moscow, Petersburg, 1905? No. Is it even Moscow, Petersburg, 1895? But then the question is why? It's not that I think people are bad. I want to know why that is.
Well, in some ways it plays the same. It plays the same role, but it's in an alternate universe.
Right, reading this history, I feel like it's an alternate
What
universe.
plays the same role? What is that role? Like,
It changes. It plays the same role in that it's a stepping stone toward the ultimate
Right.
class consciousness.
Yeah, no, I definitely guess I wish in a lot of ways. It was, Occupy Now is a moment that might even have been missed again.
right.
And
It
this-
may be
yeah.
a stepping stone, but I also think it might be, like when I think of stepping stones, I think of history, like that seems like it's thinking of history linear progressively. And it feels like there has been some sort of regression since 1905, since 1895, since 1848, that we're missing, like we're almost like below those points today. That makes it seem like these events like Occupy aren't as, I don't know, important's not the right word, but they don't bring about this, they don't express this consciousness of the political implications that they're creating.
I mean, the thing also with Occupy is from the very start, like it was very consciously directed against, we might even say, the history of Marxism, right? It was
run by
horizontalism.
The form was anarchism.
Right.
It wasn't even democracy. The form was consensus.
So then,
and that's what
I guess going back to what we were raising earlier is that like literally people live with ideological wreckage and obstacles that have accumulated over the 20th century. And it's not like these people have been alive for 120 years and that's why, but they're born into this history.
But people learned
Yeah.
from the mistakes of Occupy and its limitations because of its form. And I think you saw that in the Bernie Sanders campaign.
Perhaps, there was like this thing of we need to get serious, right? Like there are plenty of people I've encountered in all of the left organizations that have emerged along with Bernie that we need to be more serious. We can't just occupy public-private places anymore. And there were also occupations at schools, for example, like Santa Cruz, I think about a year later, or 2 years later. I think it was 2013. In terms of the learning, I mean, I guess it goes into what then is the vehicle for learning. So I have like a paragraph left I just want to read because this actually is going to tie together of why 1905, because we talk about 1905 because 1917 is this highest example. And if you're going to talk about 1917, you have to talk about 1905. And of course, when we're going to meet Lenin again in 1917, he's carrying that whole experience with him. And it's the party that's carrying it with him. It's not just that, yes, Lenin is a brilliant genius, but he could be a brilliant genius because there was a party. Right? Like without a party, he couldn't do it by himself.
Of course.
Yeah.
You have to have a vehicle.
Not just the vehicle, it's that the party was the object for him. In other words, when he returns in 1917 and he says, oh, you guys are repeating what I said in 1905, but it's a changed content, now it's like conservative. It's actually upholding the anti-insurrectionary part.
I think it was Molotov was the only person in the Central Committee that supported his April thesis.
Right. Yes, it certainly was nobody else. Although that's when Trotsky became a Bolshevik, was the April thesis. No, that's true.
In a sense, he became.
No, that's literally when he did. He was in a Canadian, a Canadian work camp. Literally. I forget, it was one of these liberals. I think it was Mayukov who was saying, no, keep that guy in Canada. We can't have him come back. Anyways, just summing up, in May of the following next year, the First Duma is founded. The cadets gain a majority. Lenin begins advocating working in the Duma to make an alliance with petty bourgeois democracy. And at this time already his own party says, like, you're contradicting yourself because just last October or August you were saying, no, we're boycotting the Duma. And he said, yes, that was a revolutionary moment. Now it isn't. Now we're waning. And so now we have to kind of dispel this last illusion with people. So he's like, yeah, we're going to fight this in a different way now. And just about a year later, you get the Stolpen Duma. So they get rid of the Duma twice, and then we get the Stolpen coup, and then we just get a totally conservative Duma. and the Bolsheviks have to go underground, and they'll reappear in 1914. In a London library reading Hegel. What people really want to know about is 1917, and we were going to cover that in a good detail this summer, but I thought it was important to set things up with 1905. 1905, just like 1917, still tasks us today. There's an idea that we are beyond 1905 because we don't have feudalism or we have the experience of 1917, which is somehow better in every way. So there's this idea that 1917 solves the problems of 1905. Whereas a better way of looking at it is it rather develops them. Okay, it might even intensify them. But the failure of 1917 means an appraisal of the revolution has to take into account the full self-understanding of the players in the moment, and because they understood 1917 as the continuation and further development of 1905, it makes reading about 1905 necessary. Any attempt to change the world makes the preceding moments appear as historical necessity. When a historical moment flashes up, it ties itself together with past moments, disobeying the temporal index. So the title to Trotsky's third chapter in Results and Prospects, it's 1793, 1848, 1905. That's how it looks in 1906 then. Right? It's not like, 1905, 1904, 1903. It's very specific moments. What the Bolsheviks were striving for in October 1917 was to make that link with 1848, 1871, and 1905 with the very moment so they could put an end to history. Okay, so that's what I wrote. But now, I guess let's continue talking about what we were saying. I guess any questions first before we go back to the Occupy thing?
Let's just continue with the Occupy thing.
Okay, yeah, well, as long as it's related to 1905 somehow. But yeah, what were you saying about Occupy then? That we had learned from it. And I guess I was trying to say that, where the learning really happens is that there's a vehicle for that learning. Okay, because this is what any of the problems with 1905, the reason that there even can be a dress rehearsal, quote unquote, even though it's not exactly, is because there's the Bolshevik and Menshevik parties that continue.
Well, and I like what you said, that it's not a problem that needs to be solved, it's something that needs to be developed.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what took place. Because you can't automatically jump up to the finest type of actions.
Right.
You have to learn by doing.
Right.
And then you look at what happened, you look at the results, and then you try something different. You learn from them. And I think, again, the Bernie campaign came about. When you think of Lenin, had Lenin not been alive or not gotten back to Germany, you would have had maybe a bourgeois weak revolution, a government something like England. Socialist and communist would have been smashed.
Right.
It was a lot to do with Lenin himself, and a lot to do with Lenin coming back at the right time. And Bernie Sanders, when he ran, suppose he wasn't around, what would have happened? What would have filled that vacuum? Nothing.
No, I am happy that Bernie ran because I can then make sense out of Donald Trump. That's the point there then. But I guess what you're saying is this play a role then of a 1905 is
Sort of, but under different circumstances.
the Bernie or all together. You can put all of them together.
They don't exactly replicate themselves because the conditions in Russia and the conditions in the United States are so totally different.
But I mean in terms of a relationship to something in the future. For example, So Mark Rudd, you might be aware of him, the SDS person. Spencer did an interview with him, and he said, look, in the 60s, especially in 68, 69, they thought they were having a 1905. It's a very specific term that he was using, which is that yes, we're getting the necessary defeat so that we can have the victory. We're getting the necessary lessons. So there was the expectation that the 1917 was going to happen in the 70s.
Well, I was there in the 70s. I disagree with that. I totally disagree. And
so I guess what was missing then, do you think that the 60s didn't have a defeat to learn from?
Oh, you always learn from defeats. There's no doubt about it. But
well, I guess I could say then, do we learn the right thing?
Well, for a long time, I don't think we did.
Yeah.
I think the problem is a political party. A political party that comes to the forefront that learns from it and begins to lead the movement. And we didn't have that.
In the 60s?
In the 60s, no, you had 15, 20 different parties Maoist, Trotskyist parties, Social Democratic, Stalinist, whatever you want to call them, and nobody had ascendancy, and you have a split, and there was no attempt to even really, I think, unify in any way. Plus, I think a large part of the movement wasn't geared at that time toward electoral struggle either.
Okay.
And so
Yeah.
I think that was one of the big lessons that people learned. You had a few.
Well, didn't it kind of go
from
towards
SDS
that with
went in.
McGovern and
Yeah, you had that. But,
Clean for Gene?
But it's quite different, and the objective conditions were different then. You had the big problem was you had the petty bourgeoisie that was revolting, whereas the labor movement itself was still under the control of social democrats working with the CIA, etc.
Right.
And now that has begun to change under Trumpkin. And so you see this movement toward the left. I mean, when's the last time? This May Day was the first time that labor, AFL-CIO, has taken a lead, along with other labor groups, to do a May Day, and not
I thought
Labor
they did
Day.
a May Day last year.
They weren't.
I thought you said you were at one and an AFL-CIO person said, could you put the
A
hammer
couple
sickle
of
down?
people showed up.
Okay.
But here they actually took the lead in doing it, and it's quite different. They actually took the lead and ran it, and it was being done all over the country. And so that's a reflection of the change that's taking place because of the objective conditions and to some historical necessity, the dead
Right.
end of neoliberalism.
So then we're advancing on the 60s.
Well, yeah, I don't.
Because
see
you
this
wanted to- it
continuation.
sound-
This
Yeah.
is an entirely new generation. It's really quite different.
Well, but
The people
generations
from-
don't fall out of the sky. I mean, I know, when I show people pictures of my mom, they go, you look like your mom, right? Like, I don't fall out of the sky. Yeah, you did. You have seen a picture of my mom. But no, the whole point is that history gets passed down and that we reproduce it. In other words, why do historical moments come back is because we reproduce them. Like, in other words, no one in 1848 is there in 1905, so why are they like 1848 is coming back?
Well, you do have people that study it and learn from it. There's no doubt about that.
Well, but what
And
they
it's
get
actually
from
similar.
what they get
It
from
is
studying it is rather what has been unconscious that they're reproducing. So this is why then I'm saying, it seemed like you implied in the 60s there wasn't a party that could ascend, but now there is a party that is ascending.
Not yet. But you
Okay.
can start to see an embryonic form of it. And right now it's being fought out. Will there be a third party or will there be a struggle within the Democratic Party to either reform it or to form a third party out of the Democratic Party at its expense, like the Republican Party and the Whig Party.
Right.
So you're beginning to see things coalesce because things are advancing, but they're still far from where we need to be.
Right.
Extremely.
So then it would be that really we are still below 1905. Like we haven't had a 1905.
No, we obviously
Yeah.
have not. No.
Yeah.
No.
We're sorry. Let's.
No, I'm just listening.
Yeah. I mean, what's the next step?
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
Well,
I do not know.
Bernie's going to run again. He's already said.
As president.
What?
Well, he hasn't announced publicly, but we already know. He's already
Okay.
said it privately that he is running. Of course, who
Okay.
knows what his health's going to be or anything else, or if there's even going to be an election in 4 years. That's a whole other question too.
There will be an election in 4 years.
I mean, we'll see what type. But
I'll bet you $1,000 there will be an
I'm not
election.
going to take. I'm
Yeah.
not going to take that one up.
Okay.
So what you have is you have a socialist, someone that calls themselves a socialist.
Right.
That got 13 million votes.
But
It's
he's
never
coming.
happened in the United States.
But the whole problem then is that if you keep reducing socialism to something lower and lower, then of course you can get people to vote for a word. But the point is, I don't care if people vote for the word. I care if what they think really about
But
it.
they're voting for something higher and higher. Bernie is an advance for the masses what existed before. I mean, I don't agree with him on a lot of stuff and, et cetera, but what he's done is
No,
he's
I-
allowed the left to grow and class consciousness to
No, I'm
grow.
saying that like even compared to LBJ, he would not have been called a socialist, but now it looks like a socialist.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist. There's no doubt
What
about
does
it.
that mean, though?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on what Bernie Sanders you listen to.
Like who
If
would
you
Bernie
listen to-
Sanders be like in the 1905? Like who would he go with? Of the people I just talked about, probably Martov. See, I think he would be in with like Milyukov actually.
Yeah.
He would be in with the legal Marxists.
Yeah, probably so. But
Wait,
But if
so
you-
with Martev or with the legal mark, that's like two different groups.
No, which you said, I think,
Yeah.
possibly. Again, Bernie is putting forward a minimal program at this point, and that's how he's getting the votes and mobilizing people. If Bernie wasn't there, or he doesn't run it in 2020, I don't know, I think it would be, there's no one else, at least that exists right now, that can carry that banner.
Do you think that? Yeah, sorry.
Is it really even still relevant though? Because it feels like, for the most part, what really was created around Bernie is kind of become it's like liquidated in different directions. Like it's either gone into the Democrats or it's resulted in
Right.
political discontents with people who don't really see an outlet. Even like I guess I don't know. I don't really see the left growing. I see people who like want to go into the Democratic Party to do resistance growing, or I see people, which just seems like a different form of like right-wing reaction, and then I see people who are just becoming discontent. I don't see how Bernie's really created a moment that he's taking further.
It's a good question. When he threw his support to Hillary, a lot of people, the Bernie or bust people, left. And there are people from their experiences working as delegates within the Democratic Party who would never do it again.
Mm-hmm.
There's no doubt of that, but it's
Yeah.
still a minority. And some even voted for Trump and
Yeah,
some for
Bernie
Jill
did.
Stein.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, now he's taken it a step further. He's building an armed revolution. And that's being organized in senatorial districts, Texas. It's being built here. It's being built across the country. So it's an electoral platform to begin to win state power. And they've taken over the state of California, the Democratic Party. And the left is actually growing. Of course, there's always splits in people that go in different directions, but overall, you look at the growth of DSA in the last 6 months from 7,000 members to 20,000 members.
Right.
Our party has grown. We've recruited 1,000 people just since Trump has taken power. Here in Houston, we haven't been this
Right,
big since
so I
the
guess-
40s.
So that's actually what worries me right there, is that actually it's growing out of Trump getting elected.
Well, no, it's Trump and Bernie. During the growth actually started during the the election itself, and no one thought Trump would win.
Some of it
Until-
did, certainly. I remember you mentioning more people.
Yeah.
But a lot of it exploded November 9th.
With DSA, especially.
So that's what worries me.
Why?
Because that's the holding pattern. Like, that's the kind of holding little group for once the Democrats think up something that they can go back into the Democrats.
Oh, you mean the DSA?
Yeah, that's why. It's the, the little
Not
pocket.
really.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, the old DSA, of course.
Why? I mean, the
new
left has
DSA
suffered, these moments before. It had Ronald Reagan, and
The new
DSA
DSA
grew
is,
with it.
the new DSA, even those that work within the Democratic Party, are very hostile. Very hostile to the Democratic Party.
They're angry at the Democratic Party.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean they're going to get away from the Democratic Party politics or just participating with them.
Well,
Yes, they're angry. Certainly, they feel betrayed. I'm not doubting that a lot of, I know a lot of people who mean really well who went and joined the DSA because they're like, what? Why the fuck would they go with Clinton? We knew this was going to happen, and this is why they're getting defeated. So, but that doesn't mean saying I'm done with the Democratic Party. It means they're done with how it was running.
Well, I work in the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
but I'm not there to build it. There's a difference, and you can work.
But the
in
question is
different
what you do in
forms.
practice,
Huh?
if that ends up building it or not.
No, the principal question is what you stand for. The form and everything is not a principal
No,
question.
because this is sort of the point that I was making at the beginning of this, is that all these people saw themselves as Marxists, but in practice they did different things.
Well, in the end, yes, it's what you do,
Yeah.
what you actually do, not where you work or who you
And-
work
and
with,
doing-
but what are the results?
Doing is agitating is, I'm not saying like doing is moving your limbs and nerves and stuff like that. I'm
Mhm.
saying that what they ended up supporting in practice, even if they said they were against the liberals, was their position.
Yeah. Oh, I
bound to
agree.
liberals.
I agree
That's
with
what-
you.
But this is why my point is that then when people say, well, I'm working in the Democratic Party, and they say, well, I'm not supporting them, but I'm working in them, then it's like, but what ends up happening in practice is that you meet the audience, right? The audience comes and hears from you, and they go, okay, well, I guess it's the Democratic Party. Because there are these cool people like Bernard Sampson, and he seems like a cool figure, and I want to be in this party.
Yeah, but when they
But
come
secretly
around,
you're like, I want them to be in the Communist Party.
I recruit them into the Communist Party.
Right.
But a great example, Socialist Alternative. What's her name in Seattle?
Shama. Yeah,
she's
Shama.
already under attack for working with Democrats.
Right.
And
by the Sparsis.
yeah, and there's no doubt that working in the bourgeois system, it can turn you.
I don't have an anarchist position. Like, all politics are bourgeois politics. Proletarian politics are bourgeois politics. That's, like, I don't have any, I'm not against electoral politics. It's rather how it's done is more the question that I'm.
Well, and also, what do you want the result to be? On the ultra
sure.
left, it's strictly to get out propaganda.
What do you
On
mean
the
by
reformist
ultra-left?
side, it's to fight for reforms to.
Sam wanted to know who you mean by ultra left.
Yeah, and also what?
Ultra left, I would say, Socialist Alternative, Socialist Workers Party.
But what constitutes that? Like, what are the characteristics of that?
The characteristic
category?
is they believe that at the time of electoral struggle, that they run candidates with no intention of winning, but getting out propaganda, recruiting, and putting the line out.
Isn't that what I was just mentioning? That's what Lenin did in the Duma.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So he was ultra left in the Duma?
Different circumstances, and working in the Duma.
What were the
circumstances?
circumstances?
The first thing is that Bolsheviks were elected.
Yeah, but that wasn't their goal. Certainly that might happen, but that doesn't. There's a difference between, like, if they elect, SWP or SALT people, I don't think they're going to say no.
But Bolsheviks in the Duma
Mhm.
did unite at times with the cadets and stuff against the Black Hundreds, etc.
In 1907, I just said 1906 though.
But the tactics can change, but it's not a principal question. The principal question is, what are the results of what you do?
Right.
If it leads toward class consciousness and the destruction of the bourgeois state, that's fine, and you can participate within the bourgeois state
Right,
and
but
do that.
the
because
ultra left people, or who you just called ultra left.
Right. They don't run to win, is what I'm saying.
So this is
Generally.
so. The question is that if they're just running in terms of propaganda, you say they can't build class consciousness. That's really where the argument's coming down now.
No, not necessarily. But what I'm saying, it can build class consciousness, but the results are a dead end in this particular case, because it takes people from an avenue of struggle that leads toward victory and takes them to a dead end that doesn't lead to victory.
But if
I mean, what's the purpose?
Yeah, I don't understand why winning would make much more of a difference than a dead end. That can also be a dead end. They had 110 seats in the SPD, in the Reichstag in 1914, and the dead end was, slitting each other's throats in the battlefields of World War I.
You run for election because you can win a position in the legislature, which can make a difference in bills and stuff that actually benefit the working class. So if we had enough votes, say in the Texas legislature, you wouldn't have SB 4. And that affects the working class very much. And you wouldn't have a bill that's going to get rid of payroll reduction. So there's nothing wrong with that. Fighting for the reforms. The problem is no reforms are permanent, and that's where reformists get it wrong. They believe you just keep fighting for democracy and you end up with socialism. And the idea of fighting for democracy is to alleviate some of the suffering and to organize people and expose the capitalist system for what it is. And that's done through struggle. People can't learn it. People don't learn things because you tell them. People learn it through going through the process of fighting.
Right, but I don't understand why they can only learn that through winning seats, because in fact, that's why I just said again and again, and I'll even quote from one of your favorite texts. It's called Left-Wing Communism, 1920. It's Bernard's favorite text. It's not.
No,
It might be one of your favorite Lenin ones.
I like it.
Yes. Whenever I make that event, you say, "Oh, that's a great text." And then when I do What Is to Be Done, you're like, "That's sectarian." But
well, no, I don't totally disagree with everything
in What Is to Be Done, it was different conditions in
Let's-
Russia. But anyways, my
Yeah.
point is that when he's talking about England,
Mhm.
he's like, "Look, we're not trying to win seats, which is the difference between us liberals and the Social Democrats. We just want the platform in order to agitate for communism."
Okay, so
And so he could build class consciousness without, it seems like for you can only justify it if you win seats and then get certain laws passed.
Well, you run to win. I don't see any purpose in running just to put out
There's a-
propaganda. You run to win.
Well, if you put out,
also
hold on.
propaganda.
When you run to win, you're putting out propaganda.
Exactly. You do both.
But so then you're the one that's separating it, because of course SALT does want to win, and all these groups that you did call ultra-left, they do want to win. They would happily take a
the
seat.
Socialist Alternative does, I agree. But the other groups, Socialist Workers' Party, Workers' World, they don't.
They want to win.
Well, I don't know. I've
Do you,
talked to
can you
Lori,
can you
I've talked to
can you look at me in the face and say, if they got the seat offered to them, they would say no?
No, of course not.
Okay. Well.
So it's not that they
If they
don't
don't
want to,
want
it's
to.
they aren't expecting
So,
to.
so really what you think then is that...
No, they have a political position that winning is helping legitimizing the system, and that's quite different.
I don't know if that's true of SWP. That
Well,
might...
I've actually had SWPers tell me that.
Okay.
And I was in the
Okay.
SWP for 6 months.
That's
So
true,
I
before
know
he went
that's
into
a
the
fact.
Spartacus League.
And I know in the Spartacus League, it's definitely true. And I know in Workers' World, it's true.
Millerandism is what it used to be called, after the French ministerial socialists.
But the real question is that why not?
No, that's fine, but I think when you put it propaganda versus running to win, then that seems like a empty phrase that I don't understand. Because of course anybody trying to win is propagandizing and vote for, they have to give a reason for voting.
What do you think Eugene Debs, when he talked about his campaigns, said that he wasn't trying to win, he was just using it for propaganda.
And even that I would think was fine, but anyways, yes.
Well, just
Sam
that
wanted
there's
to-
also things that one learns when they run. There's,
Yeah.
you have an education in the political system in which you're
Exactly.
working, and there's also kind of this fomenting of political wisdom, and that comes from having those experiences.
Exactly.
So, I don't think that it's just about, we have to go in with the Democrats because that will be where we are most likely to win, but rather what will come out of these actions that we take electorally.
Right.
What will we learn, and what will the people that we're trying to reach learn?
In other words, just to jump off that, because you mentioned the experience. In other words, when Lenin has to go underground in 1907, the reason he has them making a block against the Black Hundreds is so that this younger generation gets political experience. Right? That's really what he's concerned with. So even that has nothing to do with, it's winning seats is a great byproduct, but not necessarily the goal. It's just the fact that they can be in parliament and argue with these Black Hundreds who are saying, yeah, we need pogroms and it's the Jews, and they can say, no, you guys are reactionary, we need socialism, and you're responding to capitalism. They can get the experience of how to do that. And that's worth it, even if they weren't winning laws from the Tsar or anything. In fact, they were putting in these crazy peasant reforms in the Stolpen Duma. That was making it worse, right? Well, so then I'm still following up on your point about it's the laws and making these reforms right there, like you mentioned.
Well, I agree that you need the experience if you're elected, and not just in the campaigns, but in the legislature and stuff, because this is how we train people for a future state,
Yes.
even if the forms are going to be different. So I think that's necessary. I think everything that we do in forming coalitions and everything become embryonic forms of a future socialist state. When we fight for, say, building a civilian review board, we're in a sense building something separate in a very embryonic form against the state structure that runs the police.
You're also building new forms for the reconstitution of capitalism. In other words, the Soviets become conservative in 1917.
Right.
And Lenin himself is almost about to go through, not strike committees, factory committees. Right? Because he's like, these Soviets have the petty bourgeois element in them. And that was something that was spontaneously birthed through the masses. They might have been the counter-revolution. In Germany today, they still use the workers' councils that came up in 1918, 1919.
Well, and you have these embryonic forms that exist in Venezuela right now, too.
Well, but I guess my point in terms of embryonic forms, it's or embryonic forms, not embryotic.
Yeah.
Embryonic is for what, though? Because
Yes,
it still has to do with...
Exactly, but it's alternate. And the direction it goes politically depends on the control that you have in it, and the ideological struggle.
Sure.
And the control, and that's where the party comes in. So,
Right.
If you lose control of it, that's another question. That's your fault. But you don't try to lose control of these things. You try to steer them in a certain way. I mean, you could make the argument that these are just neutral things, but they're not. They come from the class struggle in opposition to the system that exists.
But where
and
they
the
were,
class that
how
rules.
how
where
would
they go, they can be co-opted, of course. They can go in different directions, but that's your fault if you allow that to happen.
But the genesis is one thing, and then what it becomes is another thing.
That's true, but that is not totally independent of subjective factors.
Right. So I'm still just following up in terms of when you say we're building the embryos of tomorrow.
Everything we do in opposition are embryonic forms
Yes.
of dual power. Whether they become it or not is another thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, everything from the trade unions to all types of different issues.
Yeah, no.
We have people summits, we have all these different things. You know, the electorate struggle itself.
So what are the forms today that you see as being possible for tomorrow's socialism?
Our revolution is a great example.
Okay.
It runs both within the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party. It's an independent force. And it
This is
elects
the Bernie
people.
Sanders campaign.
Yes, I think that's a good embryonic form. Now, if it goes
Is that
somewhere
a
or not, it's
what
another
is that, a
question.
nonprofit?
Yeah.
So nonprofits are the forms of socialism for tomorrow.
It could.
Okay. No, I mean,
the idea is not
possibly.
to-
Who knows?
the idea is not
Wall,
to
Wall
profit.
Street is going to,
Yeah.
be the accounting system for tomorrow. But I guess okay, so our revolution and anything else?
Well, some people say brand new Congress. I don't agree with that so much, but there's
What is that, brand new
I've never heard
Congress?
of that.
Yeah, it's an electoral form, but it includes Republicans and stuff as well, though it's mostly Democrats. I think civilian review boards, I think trade unions, I think the different feminist organizations, all different organizations that are existing from Black Lives Matter to et cetera, are all building sort of embryonic forms, separate things. They're not satisfied with what the state's doing. So they set up separate things. We have summits, we have meetings where we condemn the police, we just don't have the power to put them in jail. These are all very, very small embryonic forms. The working class does it, and it's always done it throughout history. If they become something or not is another question.
Right.
We're not on the verge of a socialist revolution, so.
Well, I mean, we're not on the verge of the Bourgeois Revolution, which is what we would have. No, that's what we would have first, of course.
What are you talking about?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
we would have the Bourgeois Revolution first. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a Bourgeois Revolution. Yeah.
Well, like I've said in the past, socialism is the last stage of capitalism.
Oh, this is from his opening remarks.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
From last year. He was at the convention this year.
Oh, you were there?
Yeah.
Oh, this year. This year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I couldn't make it in 2015, 2016.
I enjoyed it immensely.
Yeah, no, it was great. Also, Tom Barra, who you met, that's where you saw the Rosa Luxemburg.
When's the next one?
Next April,
Where?
Chicago.
See, everything's in Chicago. The DSA convention's
You're
there.
just in
our
Chicago.
convention's there. I just got back from Chicago from a labor forum, and
It's a great place to be.
it's a great place,
Expensive.
especially for working class.
I mean, I guess to
Artisans.
return to 1905, although it's totally fine bringing things up related, like in terms of parallels. I guess anything about the 1905 you wanted to bring up.
Mm. Top of my head.
You covered it pretty well.
Yeah, you did.
You really did.
I made controversial statements. That's worrying me.
Okay, what was one of the controversial statements you made?
Oh, I mean, like I was.
Did you do that on purpose?
Yeah.
To test the
Just to be provocative. No, I was actually worried that I was expecting you to say, well, this sounds kind of Trotskyist-centered.
I try not to be sectarian.
No, so you can say it, it's fine.
And I don't have a problem with you.
Because the Stalinists have like their own view of this 1905, which is like, oh yeah, Trotsky and Lenin have these different disagreements, and so like this is the beginning of the difference between them, and they're trying to kind of split them out. And Stalin later ends up abusing the kind of dictatorship of the proletariat and poor peasantry to saying, look, we have socialism as long as it's the proletariat and peasantry in power. And this is where he's getting it from.
I just think that the 1905 revolution and to some degree the 1917 revolution are they have a relevance, and they're also, in some cases, just a different world,
Yeah.
a different situation. I mean,
Well,
you have
talk about that. That's an interesting thing.
We're in an advanced capitalist country, an imperialist country. Socialism in this country would be built not with 70% of the population illiterate and the majority of the people peasants. We probably wouldn't be building. We already have industry. We have science and everything. We have the means to give to everyone, and Russia didn't have that. And so
Russia was more technologically advanced.
You had a growth of a bureaucracy that was natural that took place in the Communist Party. You had a lot of objective factors that led toward deformations in not only in the Soviet Union, but it copied that pattern and led toward revolutions in more countries that were very, very similar. And this is what we'll get right now. This is your opening remarks. You didn't have time to give in 2015. Didn't you tell me you were going to talk about China and Cuba, but you didn't have the time to do it? I don't remember.
But talk about China and Cuba, because it sounded like you were going to.
Well, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's the exact same thing. It's sort of a quirk of history.
Yeah.
That the first socialist revolution took place in a country that had a bourgeois revolution, didn't have much of a capitalist class to begin with, and they basically.
Right.
Lenin understood that at first. They were very ultra-left, and then they went back in 1921 and did the NEP, understanding that they had to develop capitalism. And of course, there was ruckus throughout the Communist
So it
Party.
failed because they didn't have the NEP?
Huh?
They didn't get a revolution because they didn't have enough capitalism?
Well, what I'm saying is that according to orthodox Marxism, you had to have the bourgeois revolution, and you had to have advanced capitalism.
Okay, so now we are going to disagree on something, because in fact, this is why I said when Marx articulated what he saw in 1848, he was not given a closed form or system, he was given a fallout. So in other words, by the time he gets to Trotsky, no, in fact, actually, you're not going to simply just have a bourgeois revolution, because the bourgeois revolution is already too late. Right?
Well, the bourgeoisie in Russia were too weak to do a revolution.
But
that's the
they were
problem.
already too weak in 1848. That's why they
Yes.
don't lead.
Yeah, but they did later.
In where? In France?
No, everywhere. I mean, in general, you had.
When starting?
Well, I don't know in France actually.
So are you saying that
But you had
after
capitalism
1905?
but you had capitalism developed in a form where feudalism was not totally overthrown in most European countries.
Uh-huh.
But the only reason it doesn't get overthrown is because the bourgeoisie becomes too opportunistic in practice. So they literally revive feudalism.
Exactly.
But even that feudalism is already disintegrated. So when they revive, when the bourgeoisie, for example, in France go in with the Orleanists and Legitimus, it's the Bourbons and the financial aristocracy. Marx makes this kind of quip. He's like, their ancestors must be rolling in their graves, because they're like, why are the Bourbons and the Orleanists, like, what is happening? And he goes, but that's because the similarities are not in their feudal lines, but in terms of them being capitalists. And so that's really what they are.
Well, I think that's one of the things about the American Revolution that was so amazing, the elimination of the feudal system. And Lenin wrote about it in 1921, talking about how important the American Revolution is, because it did what did not happen in Europe.
Oh, French Revolution.
Well, but you have nobility and titles and everything came back.
Yeah, but they're already still, this is,
They weren't totally
we read the
destroyed.
Benjamin Constant, which is why he goes, he's writing in 1819, and he goes, we have these Bourbons, but they're
Superfluous.
They're superfluous. They're subservient to civil society. And they were. They had to rely on them for loans and everything. And this is why you can get the July Revolution, 1831. But I guess my point, and returning to the 1848 point, is it's not just in Russia the bourgeoisie were too weak. It's that after 1848, they're done.
They can't take political
They're
leadership.
done for. And so rather in Russia, it's not that there's something specific to Russia, it's rather the acceleration of that process. In fact, we can even go from France to Germany to Russia, and we see, like, as we're going further in time, we're seeing the bourgeoisie actually come to its logical conclusion after 1848. It's no wonder the bourgeoisie in Russia have to call themselves Marxists, right? This is why I mentioned Peter Struve. I think Milyukov called himself a socialist. I think, what was his name? It's with a B. It's all the people that Lenin argued with early in the 1890s. But the point is that already the bourgeois revolution is undermined. And that's why, it's not like a bourgeois revolution and then a socialist revolution. Because we're not talking about a socialist revolution even in 1917.
But the point I'm trying to make is it wasn't a developed capitalist country with industry.
Sure, yes.
The vast majority of the people were not workers.
Yes, that's always going to be true, though.
Cities.
But that's always going to be true, though, and that's why the Soviets were useful. In other words, the Soviets were all the masses could come and express, all the stuff that they hated about the Tsar, and then the class could leave from that. In other words, the proletariat's always going to be a minority.
Right. Well, it's not a minority here in the United States at all.
It could
You
be.
have
I think it
150
is.
million people in the United States that are workers, and the capitalist class that actually runs this country, it's about 40,000 people. There's a very, very big difference.
But even if they are, it's sort of what made the dictatorship of the proletariat possible was not, and this is why I brought up the 8-hour day, it's not that they're the majority, because that would have meant that socialism hasn't been possible since until 1990 in the US or something, I don't even know, right? And yet Marx is saying, no, it's possible in 1848 in France, in Germany, in England, where the proletariat is totally the minority.
Well, the proletariat could take power, but how would it end up? The problem is that the idea of socialism being the next stage, it has to do with production, what it can produce, and the level of production. You didn't have that in 1848. You just didn't have.
So basically, socialism just wasn't possible then in 1848.
No, I don't believe it was.
Okay.
It doesn't mean you don't try to take state power. It doesn't mean you don't try it. In Russia, the same thing. There wasn't enough to feed anyone. That's why they had to spread the revolution.
So when did we get to that level of production that made it possible?
Hmm?
When did we get to that level of production that made it possible?
Well, that's sort of tied to the entire world because you have uneven development.
Well, do you have a
countries
year?
the United
Is it
States
1945 in the U.S. that socialism became possible?
Well, you have. I don't know. I can only tell you this: that you have to have a level of production where you can feed everyone. Where there's enough. Where the question isn't production, but the question is distribution.
Well, I guess we already mentioned the letter to Joseph Weidmann, Weidmeyer, not Weidmann, Weidmeyer, who's the St. Louis commune person.
Yeah.
And Marx writes, my one original contribution, not even is the dictatorship of the proletariat, the necessity of it. But if socialism is not possible, then there is no necessity for the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not necessary.
Well, sure it is.
Well, why would it be necessary in 1848 if it's just not possible?
Well, but you didn't have it. It didn't take place.
What didn't take place?
If it was possible, it could happen.
Well, it could have happened.
Revolutions don't happen separate from history and objective conditions.
Sorry, I'm confused. Since it didn't happen in 1848, it wasn't possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course. If it was possible, it would have happened. And it happened because of a fluke to some degree in Russia.
Mm.
And it led toward where they copied everything.
Right.
And all the other
And
states.
this is
that
your
took
point
place.
with China and Cuba.
Yeah, but China's doing something a little different and something that Russia should have continued with the NEP to some degree. A mixed economy, you don't eliminate a mixed economy under socialism, and Marx makes it very clear that you wrest control from the bourgeoisie once you have state power over a period of time.
Okay, so is China at the level of productivity that it can have socialism or not yet?
Well, they have a socialist state, but they haven't eliminated shortages yet.
Right.
At all. No, so they're not, but they're building toward it, and they're doing a pretty good job under the leadership of the Communist
I guess
Party.
what I would say in terms of 1848 is the reason the dictatorship of the proletariat was possible for Marx is because Louis Bonaparte is the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Well, dictatorship of the proletariat is who has state power, and who state power is used for And that's a little different from the economic.
But if that
side.
exists, then socialism is possible. It's
Look,
not.
look,
You can't
worker-
again, you can't like separate them out.
The working class can take power, but to build socialism, it's not necessarily that they can. That's something separate. Once you take state power, it's something different.
No, then it's just, that really just is saying there is no necessity for the dictatorship as well.
So tell me why.
So then I'm saying
so
that-
why are there no
yeah.
revolutions separate from the ones that we're just talking about? How come
This
all
is
these
what
other-
this is why platypus exists. This is what we're trying to find out. It's a great question. I wish I could answer that question.
Well, there's got to be an answer.
You
to
asked
it.
the best question today.
I meant it rhetorically. I mean, we have socialism, and you have to build with what you have, and you have to learn from the mistakes. So we learn from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. I think China, to some degree, is doing that. You know, they're playing a very dangerous game, and personally,
What if they
I think,
what do you feel that they learned from the Soviet Union?
I think they understood that you needed a mixed economy, that the NEP, under Chinese conditions, was necessary. If you look under Mao Zedong in those period, you had a disaster.
Yeah,
in
5-year
China.
plan, yeah.
All this stuff was a disaster. But today, the Chinese state owns the banks and most of the steel plants and all of these things, and they allow limited capitalism to exist under the control of the party, with party factions and every.
I guess it raises the question of what is a dictatorship of the proletariat then? I don't.
Well, you have the dictatorship of the proletariat in China. You have a communist party of 89 million members. And it's a democratic, it's a form of democracy. May not be the form that we have in this country, but they have elections, they elect people, etc.
Is China subject to capital, like U.S. capital? They are.
It is because they have a mixed economy.
So it's
And
almost like the
same thing was
workers.
taking place in Lenin.
It's almost like they don't exercise a dictatorship over capital then.
Well, they do control it to some degree.
To some degree they
Yes,
control.
of
Okay.
course, because you can't
But
control
then that's
it
my-
100%.
The dictatorship
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
proletariat if they don't have full control of it.
Well, they have control of it within the country itself, but because they're part of a world market, they also are affected in ways that, say, the Soviet Union was not in the 30s.
Well, and that would mean
during the
then that they
Depression.
don't have full control over it in their country.
They have control over the state.
Right,
And then
there
the
it was.
state, the state decides what controls they have over the economy. If they allow, the dictatorship of the proletariat never has total control over anything anyway, even under Stalin it didn't. There were disagreements, there were struggles, there were
Yeah.
different
No,
economic things.
I agree with you that it did not have
nothing's
control over
absolute.
capital.
Nothing's
Yes.
absolute, but the day after you have the dictatorship of the proletariat, you still have private enterprise, et cetera, unless you decide you want to nationalize every single little place. You know, you're going to nationalize every mom and pop store, you know, if you're going to nationalize everything, it's absurd. With the
No,
Chinese,
I
they
guess I'm
decided to
wondering
do
why
it
they're figuring out in practice that they need a mixed economy.
because they had to leap past, they never had a bourgeois revolution.
Right.
They never had capitalist development in their country. That's why. So they're doing it under the dictatorship of the proletariat. They're developing capitalist forms under the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a dangerous thing because at the same time they're allowing a hostile class, which by the way existed in the Soviet Union. Eventually it went into the party itself, into the party apparatus, and it's doing that in the Chinese
Communist
party too.
lawyers? What did Lenin call them? These lawyers, party lawyers?
Well, Lenin warned when he did the NEP against what he called bribery, and that's, corruption is what he's talking about, that would exist. But you had conditions where there wasn't enough for everybody, and people, opportunists,
So you needed
joined the party.
police. So you needed police.
Well, the dictatorship of the.
No, I guess what I'm saying
proletariat has
is that if
police.
people have to stand on line for food, then you need police that are.
Well, you have to have police anyway. I mean, the state is armed bodies of men and women.
Well, hold on,
Whether it's a
hold on.
socialist state or a capitalist state.
When Lenin encounters the Soviets, he says they don't have police.
Well, he sure set them up, didn't he? Once he had the dictatorship of the proletariat, maybe he changed his mind.
Well, I
But you
wonder
had
why
the-
that happened.
Oh, you had, because like Marx says, the capitalists will resist you taking control. You have to have a state, we're not anarchists.
Like in other words, like in your opening remarks in the 2016, you bring up the Paris Commune, Where it's the dismissal, the dictatorship of the proletariat was the dismissal of the police. Right, this is what
Well,
the
you had-
commune did, that they armed the workers and then...
Yeah, they had a militia. Yeah.
Right, you get rid of the special bodies of armed men. So
No,
then I'm
you-
asking, why did the special bodies of armed men exist in what you were just talking about as the dictatorship of the proletariat?
I'm not quite understanding the question. If you have.
In other words,
all
I'm saying if
states-
police
all
are
states-
existing, then you're not having the dictatorship of the proletariat.
I mean, all states have armed bodies of men and women.
Right.
They
Because
have
they are
that
capitalist states.
because you have contradictions that exist. That
Right.
You have two classes or three classes
Yes.
that don't get along. You have to have it.
I agree.
Right. It's a tool of, state is a tool of oppression.
Right.
Of one class by another. And the police are just a form separate from the CIA or the NSA or a militia or
Deep
the
state.
military or, you have sheriffs and you have police, those two different forms right
Right.
there. It doesn't matter what the form is. You have to have armed bodies of men and women to defend against counter-revolution.
Right. Well, what Lenin meant by special bodies of armed men is it's a group that's separate from society. That's why the state rises above, right? I know you've read State and Revolution plenty of times, right? And so what I'm saying is that if people are standing online waiting for food and you have a special body of armed men who are rising above, then you don't have a dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the mea culpa right there. And so you were kind of collapsing it and just saying, well, there's always police.
Well, I'm not quite sure what you're getting to. You're saying that you have police because there's lines for food, so the police are there to regulate it so there's not violence or attacks on the food distribution centers, right?
Yeah,
How does
they're
that-
invested in property. It's right there. That's
Yeah, but
fine.
it's because it's.
What was that? Sorry, yeah.
It's because you don't have enough to go around. Your means of production are not at high enough level to do that. So of course you have that, and that's part of the whole problem. What happened in the Soviet
No, I mean,
Union,
I think it
that the revolution
easily would have
happened
been
in these backward
possible if they
countries.
got a revolution in West Europe, but they didn't, and so they had to collapse to this in order to survive and try to get another revolution going elsewhere. Maybe in China.
So
they
I'm
tried
not
that.
quite sure what you're saying. Even if we had a revolution tomorrow, say in the United States,
Sure.
we would set up a police force, wouldn't we? A new police force.
Provisional, sure.
Provisional.
But we would need a revolution in all of the Western industrialized countries. Like, it's not like if
But
we have it in the
but
US and so
regardless
we're
of that,
done.
you'd still have a police force in all these countries.
No, there's a difference between the armed workers and special bodies of armed men. That's the whole point. You even said it. You said, yeah, the police and the state show up if you have two classes that are fighting.
Yeah, but socialism still has classes.
Yes, capital and
So
wage
you still
labor.
have police, you still have armed bodies of men. The
Yes.
form it takes may be different. And definitely what the police do is different. The violence that they produce
Well, it's
is
not
against
just,
different
well,
people.
it's not like it's the police are just directed different. It's actually that the police have been dismissed and it's armed workers, which is different.
No, but you'd set up a police force under socialism.
Not necessarily, no, you don't need a GPU.
You're not
Hold on,
going to have-
you don't,
of
hold on.
course you do, of
You don't
course
need
you
a
have
seat,
that.
no, that
Of
is
course you do.
ridiculous.
Well, you have where are the capitalists gone? Where are these military people, these militia, these tens of thousands of militiamen
That's
that
absurd.
are ready to kill communists? What do you think, they're just gonna give up their arms? You
No.
think that terrorism and stuff is going to not exist against the state, against assassinations and attempted assassinations by right-wing?
But then that's not,
You have to
it's not a
have-
dictatorship of the proletariat right
Of
there.
course it is.
No, it's a provisional revolutionary government, certainly.
No, but it is a dictatorship of the proletariat because the working class is in power. Of course it is.
Yeah, I mean, we might as well elect Trump and then we have a dictatorship of the proletariat in the US.
Well, if we elected Trump, we probably would have that. That's very possible. But the dictatorship of the proletariat, its job to transfer power, property and stuff eventually to the people, to take it away from.
You know, Lenin used to say in 1917, you're following in the footsteps of Louis Blanc. Do you know why?
No.
He was a worker who was in power in France. And yet Marx was like, no, we need a dictatorship of the proletariat. You can't just have the workers in power, that's not it. You gotta smash up the state.
Well, I said that. In no way do I believe you can take over the capitalist state and use it for the benefit of the working class. Absolutely not.
Right.
The state has to be smashed, dismantled, whatever terms you need. That's the big struggle that's
Right, you have to
going on in
dismiss,
Venezuela
you have to
right now.
dismiss the police.
Of course.
Right.
But
then that's my point, which
then
is
you
that
set
when the
up a
police
new
are
police force.
no, but that's the workers. That's the point.
Yes, of course, it's made up of the workers. And instead of going through the Third Ward, they go through River Oaks. It's totally different. Yes.
I hope they go
The
through.
violence-
I hope
the
they go
violence
through
is
all of.
directed-
I hope they go through all of Houston.
Well, of course. But what I'm saying is the violence that's used from one class to another changes.
It's actually more of a reason why you don't need secret police, because if it's the majority suppressing the minority, this is also another thing in your opening remarks.
Well, I look at what happened in the Russian Revolution.
No, I agree. You look
Foul.
at what happened, but that's our point, though. In other words, that was a failure at a dictatorship of the proletariat. That was a failure at it.
Because they had to set it up? I mean, because...
No, that's the mea culpa, I would say, rather than. Yeah. It's Trotsky's point in Revolution Betrayed. Your favorite person, that's why.
I don't hate Trotsky. However, I did see the movie the other day, The Chosen One, on Netflix.
Yeah, you like seeing him assassinated.
Actually, I don't. I don't think it was necessary to do it.
Nice, Danny.
Anyways, back to 1905.
I'm gonna head out in a second.
Okay.
It's getting towards 7.
Maybe we have it till 7:30. That's not why the alarm went off, though.
No, I know it's not, but I've got stuff.
Okay. Well, anything else on 1905 until?
What strikes me as interesting is the difference in character of how the working class or the proletariat self-organizes itself in 1905, whereas today it feels like it's pulling teeth when you have to organize people because they don't even recognize those categories. They don't recognize themselves. Like if they even recognize themselves as workers, they sure as hell don't recognize themselves as proletariat. So it kind of raises the question: what's missing today for this seeming spontaneity? I don't have an answer.
It was funny in 1905 they had to prove that. Lenin was like, "Oh, you guys are with the bourgeoisie." He would say to people who were calling themselves Marxists, and he could never really demonstrate that until the end of 1905, and maybe the early in the Duma, for example. So he had to almost demonstrate to people like there is a class struggle. So it wasn't always clear like then, right? It wasn't clear in France until the workers insurrect in the streets of Paris in June, right? Yeah. So it's tricky. I mean, in terms of classes continuing to exist under the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's not really people we're talking about so much as the classes or categories, wage labor and capital, right? Because, expropriating the capitalists, you still have the capitalist class, which is capital. That's why. Because it's not like these people who went in with the bourgeoisie were capitalists, they were calling themselves Marxists. They weren't running factories, but their politics had to fall onto the side of capital. In other words, the proletariat always will be the minority, but where they are in the democratic revolution forces people to take sides. It forces the mass majority of people to take sides, and that's what happened. And so that's why people like Martov, who has read more Marx and probably closer to more Marxists than I ever will know in my life, finds himself on the side of capital. That's why, on the capitalist class. Even if he's I'm against all the capitalists. That's the class struggle. That's what's meant by it. You want to say something?
No.
Okay.
No. But I do like to take all these lessons and relate them to what's happening today.
Absolutely, sure. I guess, the thing I would raise is that I would like to take these and relate them today, but I find it hard too. I don't think I can just learn from this and just go and do it. That's why.
Well, I think you have to be involved in the struggle. You have to be involved in the struggle, to defend the working class and to work within organizations of the working class. I think that's important.
So that would be what's missing.
And that's where you would apply them.
Well, I mean, we could even say there are plenty of people who do that. They don't seem to learn anything from the this as well.
Well, some don't. A lot of people don't bother to read or go to study groups.
Yeah, but they might. I'm sure plenty do. I mean, I always keep meeting union organizers who say that they read Marx all the time.
But what does it say that that's so obscure? The lessons of 1905 and 1917 are so obscure to these people who say that they're trying to take these events and put it into practice. It's not just they can't read and that they, they're too stupid to do it, but it seems like there's this fundamental break with history that we just don't seem to. There's this.
That's why you said earlier it was
not that it's
totally different
that we
world.
can't learn from it, but rather that we have to learn from it in a different way than just saying, "Oh, we
learned the lessons."
Yeah.
Well, when you read it, it's very what's the word? It's very abstract when you read it. But when you're involved in the movement, it's not abstract, and so it's difficult to transform one into the other and to learn, because it is different conditions. Everything is different, and while you're involved in the movement, you're hit by all the objective factors in the class struggle that make you move to the left or move to the right. And so a lot of times it's much more difficult to use what you've learned in the past as a navigational system, and to learn from it. It's difficult.
I guess what I'm worried is that even saying change conditions, and this relates back to the Trotsky and Lenin and Luxemburg looking at 1848 and then looking at 1905, they had seen that things had deepened and actually become more obscure. And this is why I was mentioning you have like Marxists who are really actually liberals in 1905. Meaning that when we look back at 1905, we can't just say it's change conditions and I'm looking for examples, that if I go and join a union I can figure out how to put into practice, but that we might have regressed even, as you said earlier, that we're actually below 1905, and so maybe it's not clear, not because it's just change conditions, but because literally we understand the world much less than we did.
Well, the world has changed. I mean, we have 5 socialist states that exist. We have a bunch that failed and had counter-revolutions. That's something that didn't exist before, and they still exist, and they're fighting and struggling to stay alive. Basically, when there's no longer the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, and you have the balance of forces has shifted quite a bit. And so everybody has had to retreat in some way. That's what's nice about the Bernie campaign, is I think it's beginning to change things in people's consciousness that we can win, that we can make a difference. And it's the first big, results here in the United States is the fall of the Soviet Union and stuff, that socialism is coming back in a major way that hasn't existed.
Did you mean there was like a feeling of socialism coming back in 91? You just mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union. You said
no, just the opposite.
Okay.
Just the opposite. It's we do work and we see things change at a very, very slow rate, and people lose patience a lot of times, and then all of a sudden you have these revolutionary leaps, things that happen. And I think that again, Occupy was one. I think in the Bernie Sanders campaign is one. They're not perfect. There's a lot of problems with them. I like Bernie. I think he's done a lot. I definitely don't agree with him on many subjects. But he's mobilized people, and it's led toward greater consciousness. People say, well, Bernie's got me interested in reading socialism. That's something right there, right? That's a step in the right direction for what we want.
Well, who knows?
We're not going to do it if
I don't know if I can just say it's a step in the right direction.
Well, sure it is. People reading Marx, people reading Lenin, that's a good thing.
Yeah, but
it's a start. If people weren't doing it before, the idea of history was dead. Communism has failed. When they say communism has failed, they mean socialism, the dictatorship, the proletariat, everything, not just that form of socialism. It's everything. Now people don't feel that way. Look at young people, and how many people think that capitalism has failed.
Well, most
That's
of
great.
the
It's a big change.
people
The problem is, what are we going to do?
Most of the Bernie Sanders people are very specifically, I'm for socialism, but not those countries, the Soviet Union. That's why when Bernie Sanders was interviewed by Ezra Klein, he said, I'm a democratic socialist.
He said he's a democratic socialist who when he did the Eugene Debs movie, was very clear about the dictatorship of the proletariat and against the Democratic
Well, I guess
Party.
my point is
He's,
that people just reading these things, it's what they make out of it, because they might be trying to figure out how to cut it into something that is digestible for the Democratic Party.
I don't think they understand socialism anywhere near the same way that you would.
Yeah.
I think they think like.
No, you're right.
Yeah. So.
No, this guy's a genius.
Who?
Bernard.
What do you mean?
No, I'm saying he knows.
I mean, you're right. People, the question is people don't know what socialism is. But they want socialism, and they don't like capitalism. And that didn't exist
No, I
10
guess
years ago.
Sam's point and my point was that these people could be reading these to actually shirk from the dictatorship of the proletariat, to actually try to find ways, however unconsciously, to actually avoid Marxism by reading Marx.
And they misunderstand at bottom what is meant by what you mean, what we mean by these things. And so what they actually want when they say socialism is like, I don't know, Nancy Pelosi's dream of.
Libraries are socialism.
Yeah.
Well,
Snow
the
shovelers.
capitalists do that now. They read Marx so they can fight against Marxism. But, and
They
there's
might
no
read
doubt.
Marx honestly.
Huh?
They might read Marx
Oh,
honestly.
they do. They do. They do. And they understand what it is, and that's why they cover it up. And that's why they change its meaning when they talk
No,
about
I mean,
it.
not even cover it up. I mean, honestly think that there's something like not, they can think of themselves on the side of the workers.
So people are like that in both sides. I mean, people are like that in both sides. There's no doubt. I mean, for instance, when you were at the class the other
Yeah.
night,
Mm-hmm.
you have people that were in the class that actually consider themselves Marxist-Leninists in DSA. Most of them were in the party as well. Then
In
you
the
have-
DSA?
Huh?
In the DSA.
Of course, yeah. There's
Marxist-Leninist.
There's a Marxist-Leninist faction. We recruited Anam in the party.
Mm.
And there's some that would join, but they can't because of it being the Communist Party and the jobs that they have. And we're very popular in DSA. But then you have the other people like Jerry, who's very hostile.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a person that if he did read Marx, which he doesn't, he's not a Marxist, but if he did, he would use it, against Marx and against the working class, the
Sure.
ultimate aims.
Which is why when people go and read Marx, they might be.
Yeah,
what
but
you
there's
just
nothing
said.
wrong with reading Marx.
No, I have nothing wrong about it as
It's a
well.
good
I'm
thing.
just.
It's a good thing that.
I don't think it's a unanimously good thing.
Okay, see, that's.
I think what matters more is not just.
They treat. Look, they teach Marx at this school.
Yes,
Yeah.
but what I'm.
I don't think that
All right.
Marx is
All right,
self-evident.
yes.
I think that it matters how there's a way in which you have to understand him. You can't just read him and all of a sudden it like clicks. I mean, maybe that happens with some people,
Yeah.
but it's not
Right.
something that's readily apparent to us. I think it's even more obscure to us today than it was
Exactly.
in 1970.
And this is why 1905 is obscure to us
But you
today,
have
and not
to-
just change conditions.
Right, but you have to read Lenin, you have to read Marx, you have to read these people, and if there's an interest in socialism and people begin to read it, that's a step in
You gotta
the
read
right
them
direction.
you gotta read them in a certain way.
No, you have to see the world either it's a positive action or it's a negative. There's always going to be exceptions, and everything can always be used against you, your own weapons. That's just part of life. That's always going to exist. But if you don't have people interested in socialism 10 years ago, and now you have 13 million people that vote for a socialist, no matter if you think he's a socialist or not, that is a good thing. You're moving forward. Now you can tear it all apart and analyze it and make it into everything else, and then pretty soon you're not doing anything. You're not involved
I'm
in
telling
it.
people the
It's
truth.
a cynical attitude. You have to be positive about these things. It is a step in the right direction. It's
No, I
up
don't-
to
I
us
don't
to
think you
reach
have-
out to these people and to.
I don't
and
think
to
one
show
has to be
people.
delusionally positive.
Well, you use the term delusional. I didn't say delusional, but I think it's positive.
But I think it's appropriate.
Okay,
I think
well,
that's appropriate.
I probably emphasize it more than you might, but I think it is important.
Because
in the
when-
United States,
Yeah.
in the United States, for 13 million people to vote for a socialist is a very big deal. Is
Because
it an
one
end all
because
or
one
nothing?
criticizing Bernie Sanders'
Hmm?
socialism, and this exactly could be actually more positive and more optimistic, which is that I think that people can see through his sort of shallow socialism and actually like
Yeah, well, we say
understand
that.
one.
No, I mean, we don't worship Bernie Sanders. We don't worship him. We
Yeah.
have major disagree. The labor forum I was just at, he came up and
Well,
major
now they
disagreements.
now they have no problem hitting him out because he's like a Hillary Clinton shill, but now they have no problem saying.
Well,
I understand their anger now. Yeah,
there's an argument if his strategy is correct or not. That's a different question. But I don't think we should be attacking people that are. I don't think Bernie's leading us down the wrong road. I think he's mobilizing and concentrating all these people into the electoral struggle that are against capitalism. Now, where they go with that depends on who approaches them and who educates them further. But he's the one that grew this. Now we're the ones that need to reap it, and what we reap depends on how we take care of it. I mean, I don't think recruiting people to socialist or communist organizations is the wrong thing to do in this case. I think it's the right thing to do, because if you don't, they go off somewhere else and you just lose them. I think it's very important. I can't imagine why there would be a negative attitude toward the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, specifically on some of his positions, obviously, of course. But you have to see it as a whole within American society.
I do. That's why.
I don't see it as a negative at all. I think it is an opportunity for us to step in.
Well, I mean, the Bernie Sanders moment might have already been missed, actually. I mean, I remember when I met you in 2014, like there probably was more of an opportunity right then.
Well, we set up the first Bernie Sanders website in the country. But I don't think we had any illusions about him then. I mean, Denmark is not a socialist state, and his positions on Israel and everything else are terrible. But at the same time, he's a person with contradictory nature. I mean, he honeymooned in the Soviet Union, etc. He's had a relationship with the party, Scott Marshall, etc. All these people for years too. He calls himself a democratic. I'm a democratic socialist.
Not an authoritarian one?
No, absolutely not.
Why
absolutely not? Because democracy is a tool of oppression.
You just stole my answer from the other night. When this guy was saying, democratic socialism, and I'm like, democracy is authoritarian.
He doesn't even know what democracy is.
Of course, it's authoritarian.
He doesn't have any idea what it is. But that's Jerry.
Yeah, that was a good meeting.
Yeah. Except for Fabian, I think, weird stuff.
He was fine. He was worth it.
I didn't know he was still around.
Fabian?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just haven't seen any of his stuff because he doesn't have a big online presence anymore.
He has his little group that meets secretly. He got rid of his Facebook.
Yeah.
I think he has maybe 2 or 3 people at best. It's a secret cadre organization.
Is it FRSO still, or is it?
Yeah,
okay.
the Fight Back group. The other group actually works with the party.
That's FRSO, yeah.
I see.
But they're not here in Houston.
Right.
Are you in a particular group?
Yes. Platypus.
Just Platypus.
Oh, but I mean, political party or?
I guess not particularly. No, I'm still